I'm going to try to spend more time on the things that I think you're probably most interested in. But since we do have sort of a smaller group today, if you have any questions, stop me at any time. You can either come on mic or you can type it in the chat. I have the chat open in front of me so I can see that. So certainly if there's something you want to discuss, there's something you want to ask, please do. Don't feel like you have to wait until the end to do that. So I'm not going to tell you a whole lot about myself. You probably aren't totally interested in that, but I'll tell you I am based in the US, in Louisiana to be specific. I'm a licensed customs broker. I've been in global trade for a very long time. I won't age myself, but it's been a minute. I own Magnolia Global Trade Solutions, which is a consulting firm that helps importers and exporters with global trade compliance. And we help clients in Europe, Canada, and the US. So that's sort of our geography where we operate. So, not trying to sell you anything today, just want to update you on what is going on under President Trump. And there has been a lot. So, during President Trump's first term in office, so this was in 2017, we saw that he enacted Section 301 tariffs. Now, these were enacted on Chinese origin goods only. Okay. So the way that this worked is the US came out with a list. They called it Tranche One. Okay. And they put all kinds of HTS codes on there. It was things like alcohol and food and, various items like that. Right. And they said, we're going to put a 25% tariff, an extra 25%. So this is above the flat MFN rate. Right. We're going to add an additional 25% tariff to all of the goods on these HTS codes. China said, okay, we're going to do the same. So they did exactly the same and they retaliated with their own tariffs. And the US said, well, I'll see you one further and I'm going to come out with list two. So now we had list two of items that President Trump was going to put an additional tariff on. Then China, retaliated with their list two. Then we had list three. Then China had list three. Then we had list 4A and China had another list. Then we had list 4B and China had another list. So it was a lot of like tit for tat back and forth back in 2017, 2018. Where it stands today is that there are still Section 301 tariffs in place. It's either 25% or 7.5%, depending on the list that your goods fall under. You can find that in the HTS if you need specific help with that, send me an email. I'll show you exactly how to do it. It's not super difficult, but it is a little hard to find if you just don't know where to look. So happy to help you with that. So that is still in effect. What happened with, and it keeps 301 in mind because we are going to come back to it later as a result of the recent Supreme Court decision. It's possible we're going to see more 301 cases. So kind of keep that in mind. We'll come back to it later. But so we're still seeing Section 301 tariffs in place today. What happened with the Section 301 tariffs was sort of unique. So we had an exclusion request process that happened where you could write in as an importer and say, well, I, need my good. China's the only place I can find my good. Maybe you make something out of a specific grade of steel that is only manufactured in China, right? Then you can write in and say, hey, this isn't fair to me because I don't have a choice but to buy it from China. So please exempt me from these additional tariffs. And there were a lot of tariff exclusions granted for certain very specific products where you didn't have to pay these Section 301 tariffs. Now, a lot of those exclusions have expired. There's only a very, very small group that's left that hasn't expired yet. And the reason I'm mentioning these exclusions is because the next set of tariffs we're going to talk about are Section 232 tariffs. These are the ones on steel, aluminum, copper, and we'll get into those in a second. But a lot of people come to me and they ask, well, where's the exclusion process for 232? Because they remember that exclusion process for Section 301 tariffs on those Chinese origin goods, but there isn't the same process for 232. It doesn't exist. Now, there have been a couple of rounds of the, being released in the Federal Register where the government said, tell us what you want added to the list. So instead of tell us what you want exclusions on, it was tell us what goods you want us to charge tariffs on. Maybe you were looking at your competitors and saying, well, it's not fair that like my good falls under Section 232, but theirs somehow doesn't. I want it to be added. Or maybe there's another reason you want it to be added. So it's the opposite process here. So far, now it could come in the future, right? But so far, we have not seen an exclusion process for Section 232 goods. So I just want to kind of connect the dots on that. There is some confusion there. So I wanted to try to clear that up. So again, Section 232. So these goods are mostly during President Trump's second term in office. So his current term that started only a little over a year ago. Can you imagine? It feels like it's been years with so much that's been going on, but it was January 20th of last year that he took office. So really hasn't been that long. We have tariffs on steel, aluminum, copper, and automotive parts. Now, these have been causing major heartburn, partly because they started out at 25% and now they're at 50% for the most part. So that is just a very high number to add on again to your MFN rate, right? So you could have a base duty rate, your MFN rate of say 10% or 8%, and then you're adding on another 50%. That it just makes your margins, your profit margins, very, very slim at that point, right? So it's been very difficult. The really hard part is mostly talking about the steel products. So with the steel products, you pay that 50% tariff on the value of the steel in the product only. So whereas other tariffs, like your Section 301 tariffs, are based on the full value of the product, so it's pretty easy to calculate, right? The steel tariffs, you have to figure out the amount of steel in your product. So trying to grab something around me. So let's say we have this pen, right? And I'm importing this pen. It looks to me like most of the pen is likely plastic, right? All of this sort of tan portion. But what about these little bits, right? The little clip, the end of it, this little ring in the middle, and then the tip here. I don't know that they're steel. Let's pretend for the purpose of this exercise that it's steel. So I would have to, as an importer, take this pen and figure out the value of only the steel bits. And then that's what I'm going to pay 50% tariff on. But the guidance on how to figure out that is not clear. A lot of people are trying to say that the value that the guidance that was put out, which is a short paragraph, that guidance says that the importer should value the steel on what they paid for it. So on what the company who manufactured the pen, what did they buy these steel bits for from their manufacturer? That's what they're trying to say that the value should be on. I disagree with that. I think that the guidance is saying that whatever the importer is paying for the pen, you need to pay on that value of the steel. So let's say you manufacture this pen for $1 and you sell it for $2. When your manufacturing cost of the steel is 50 cents, then you should pay $1 for the steel. Does that make sense? So you need to mark up the value of the steel as much as you've marked up the value of the pen, and that's what you pay on. So there's a big debate there, and nobody really knows how to calculate that. There are also other steel products where it's generally sold a price per kg, right? A price per kilo. So how do you value that? Do you weigh the material? Do you weigh the amount of steel and then calculate it that way? Well, what if that value changes, right? You can understand the complexity here. So there has actually been a lawsuit filed in the US asking customs to please clarify this issue for us, because importers are worried about both directions. They're worried about underpaying and undervaluing on their steel, and they're worried about overvaluing and overpaying, right? If they're underpaying today, they don't want the CBP, Customs and Border Protection, to come back later and say, well, you undervalued, so now you owe us $1 million. Right? They don't have that, to be able to just throw out the window. On the flip side, if they're overpaying today, it might be difficult for them to get those refunds of the amount that they overpaid. And also, they don't want to be overpaying today. They need that cash flow, right? So it's a really difficult situation. There is a summit, we'll call it, going on with CBP at the end of April. So with this lawsuit being filed and that summit at the end of April, I would put money on it that we're going to have guidance come out between now and April. Otherwise, CBP is going to be facing, 1,000 people at the summit, with pitchforks, so to speak, right? Just saying like, please help us. Like, we really need this guidance. So that's the big thing. Other than the fact that like these duties are 50%, they're super high, they're outrageous. The bigger issue with this Section 232 tariffs right now is give us guidance. We want to do it right, and we don't know how to do it. Again, just like I said for 301, keep 232 in mind. We're going to come back to it later when we talk about the recent Supreme Court decision. Oh, sorry, I missed one. Medium and heavy duty trucks and buses also have 232 as well. All right, so the big one, IEEPA tariffs. This is the one that surely you've heard by now that we got a recent Supreme Court ruling. So just to clarify, we had two sets of tariffs that were issued under the IEEPA framework. So IEEPA stands for the International Economic Emergency Powers Act. So that's what IEEPA is short for. So we had two sets of tariffs. We had the ones that were supposed to combat fentanyl, okay, because we have a fentanyl problem in the US, right? So it was said that Canada and Mexico and China were contributing to that problem, to that drug, epidemic in the US. And so President Trump added an additional tariff to those countries to combat the flow of fentanyl. So that was imposed under IEEPA. Then you had the reciprocal tariffs. So you may remember what President Trump called Liberation Day. And he got on a stage and he had these big posters behind him. And they had all these lines, colorful, like orange and black lines on them. And it said a country name and then a duty rate percentage. And a lot of, the late night talk show hosts ate it up because there were like islands on there where only penguins inhabited that he had put a tariff on, right? I don't know what the penguins are trading, but that was kind of silly. So you may remember that. Those are the reciprocal tariffs. Those were the tariffs that were put on basically every country in the world. Some countries had unique duty rates assigned to them that were supposedly based on the deficit, the trade deficit, and trying to balance that. Others, if they weren't on that list, were given a flat 25% rate. Now, this rate, especially for China, imports from China, has changed drastically over time. We could spend an hour talking about how it went from 10 to 25 to 125, back down. You would get whiplash, right? But just know that the reciprocal tariffs have changed over time. Both of those groups of tariffs, the fentanyl tariffs and the reciprocal tariffs, fall under the IEEPA framework. So we had a couple of importers who said that they filed a court case, and that court case traveled all the way up to the Supreme Court. So in the US, you start at a lower court, and then if you want to challenge that court's decision, it goes up to the next higher court. You challenge that decision. It keeps going up until it gets to the highest court in the land, which is the Supreme Court. So this case went to the Supreme Court. And what the case was specifically saying is that IEEPA, again, the International Emergency Economic Powers Act, does not allow for the president to impose tariffs. So that the tariffs that he imposed were not allowed by IEEPA at all. And so they should be, thrown out, right? They should be not allowed. So the Supreme Court took 10 months, which is actually very fast for that court, to come back with a decision. And they came back with it last Friday. So we scheduled this webinar perfectly, Fiona. Great job. So it came back last Friday. What the court said is they agreed with the petitioners and they said, you're right, IEEPA does not authorize the president to impose tariffs. So all of the tariffs that have been collected so far are sort of up in limbo at this point. However, the Supreme Court went a couple steps farther than that. Not only did they say that the president couldn't impose tariffs under IEEPA, they directed the president to where he could impose tariffs, which for President Trump was like, a golden ticket coming down from the sky. So what they said is you can't do it under IEEPA, but what you can do is Section 122, you can use for a short time. 201 and 301. Now, you'll remember 301 from earlier. Remember, Section 301 was the first group we talked about. Those are those Chinese tariffs where we went back and forth with China and kept, tit for tat, imposing more tariffs. These are all, when we say section, it's a section of the Trade Act of 1974. So if you go under the Trade Act of 1974, you'll see all of these sections in that act. So they said, again, you can't impose them under IEEPA, but hey, Mr. President, here are all of these other ways that you can impose tariffs. So what do you think the first thing President Trump did literally on the day the decision came out? Of course, he imposed more tariffs and he put them under 122. So what happened is 2 days ago on the 24th, we stopped collecting those reciprocal tariffs. We stopped collecting those fentanyl tariffs, those IEEPA tariffs, and we began collecting a 10% tariff under Section 122. Now, 10% is a heck of a lot better than a lot of the other tariffs that were under IEEPA, meaning lower. Most of the IEEPA tariffs hovered around the 25%. So 10% is an improvement. Another improvement is, and by the way, the new tariffs that started 2 days ago, the Section 122, that's on every country. It's a flat 10% on every country, no matter what. There are some exclusions. It's the same exclusions that fell under the reciprocal tariffs. So you had Annex 1 and 2 under the reciprocal tariffs. You have those same annexes under the Section 122 tariffs. So we saw that start 2 days ago, 10%. You may have seen on Truth Social where President Trump said that he was going to increase that to 15%. That has not come to fruition. President Trump says a whole lot on Truth Social that never actually happens. So be careful if you're looking at Truth Social posts. Some of it does come to fruition. Some of it does happen. But what you want to look for is if you go to the White House website, I think it's whitehouse.gov, look for the presidential proclamations there. And that is going to be the stuff that's actually going into effect. So what I look for is those presidential proclamations. Then I'm going to see that followed by what's called a CSMS message from Customs and Border Protection. You can subscribe to those. If you go to the Customs and Border Protection website and look for CSMS messages, it's free. You can just type in your email and you'll start getting those directly to your inbox. That's a really good way to keep up with what's going on in U.S. trade, because if it comes from Customs and Border Protection, it's happening. It's true. And that's where you're going to get the nitty-gritty details like, okay, I know I have this new 10% tariff. Well, what HTS code do I need to use for that? And in what order do I put that on my entry? Like, do I do the Section 301 first and then the 232 and then that? It will tell you that in the CSMS messages, whereas the presidential proclamation will be more wordy and, tell you kind of high level what's happening. The CSMS is where you're going to get those details. All right, so we have our Supreme Court decision. We have these new tariffs under 122. We're also, I would bet that we're going to see more of those Section 301 tariffs, like we talked about earlier, the ones on China. And I would bet that we're going to see more Section 232 investigations, like we already have the steel, aluminum, copper, and so on. So we'll talk a little bit more about that later. One other thing I want to mention about the Section 122 tariffs. So those are the new tariffs that just went into effect 2 days ago. They're only good for 150 days. So whereas the tariffs that the president enacted under IEEPA, which we found are not allowed, but he thought that they were unlimited forever, right? There was no time frame attached to them. However, under Section 122, you can only do them for a brief time. What I don't know yet is what happens after the 150 days. Can he extend it for another 150 days? I'm not quite sure on that yet. I think we're all still kind of learning, about that. All right, I'll pause there. I know that was kind of a lot. If anyone has any questions, put them in the chat, speak up. Let me know. All right.
Hi.
So I bet your big question is, oh, sorry. Yeah, go ahead, Chase.
I was gonna say, I have a quick question about the
Yeah.
in-transit exemption for the Section
Yeah.
122.
Mhm.
So, is that a small window where you get 0%, or would you still be paying the 25 or the whatever the IEPA that you might pay previous?
Yeah, I'd have to go back and look at it exactly, but off the top of my head, if I remember right, the IEPA tariff ended at the same time that the exemption for the 122 began. So I think like at midnight on, I guess between the 23rd and the 24th, you know what I mean? Like that
Mhm.
night, if you entered it before midnight, you paid reciprocal. If you entered it after midnight, you paid 122.
Okay. So
I am
it's
like 99% sure that that's accurate, but I can double check that for you.
okay. So I thought it was like a small window to get like 0%, but I could be wrong too. So
Well, let me look that up for you after, and I can definitely email you. Fiona, you have Chase's email address?
Yep, I'll share that with you, Bunny. Yep.
okay,
Perfect.
thank
Yeah,
you.
Chase, I want to, that's a really good question. So I definitely want to look that up for you. Let me make a note. The 122 exemption is what you're asking about. Okay.
Right.
Yeah. Again, I'm pretty sure it was like midnight, before midnight you pay reciprocal, after you pay 122, but I could always be wrong. So I'm happy to look into that further and then shoot you a quick email after. Great question though.
Thank you. I appreciate it.
Yeah, no problem. Anybody else have a question so far? Okay. So the big question for everyone is, okay, the IEPA tariffs are now unconstitutional. I paid all this money, likely, millions, if not, if you're a smaller business, at least, 100,000 more than that. It was a lot of money. How do I get it back? Well, great question. So what happens next is the Court of International Trade and CBP, Customs and Border Protection, are reviewing together what needs to happen next. In one of the dissenting opinions to the Supreme Court decision, there was a brief mention of the Customs and Border Protection may need to issue refunds. However, throughout and then they followed that with, and we understand it will be a mess. Yes, it's going to be a mess. But what the Supreme Court decision didn't do is say that refunds had to be issued. It's heavily implied, and I think the Court of International Trade and Customs and Border Protection are going to, come to that decision. But the Supreme Court decision did not explicitly say, it didn't instruct anybody to, provide refunds. I would bet that they are coming. It's just going to be a matter of how that happens. When does that happen? All of that is still being decided. Customs and Border Protection did send out a CSMS message. I believe it was it was either the day of the decision or that Monday, following the Friday of the decision, that said basically like, give us a minute. I'm paraphrasing here, right? But it was basically like, we get it. We know that you're looking for refunds. Give us a minute to figure it all out. So they are working on it. They know that that's top of mind for everyone. As far as what you should be doing right now, that's debated. Um, so that's debated. The issue that I have and what I'm kind of telling some of my clients is that, entries liquidate. So that means they finalize typically in 314 days. The first IEPA tariffs were collected on April 15th of 2025. So if you go online and you type in what's 314 days after April 15th, 2025, you find out that it's this week. Okay, which I don't think is a coincidence, but it is this week that those first IEPA, those first entries into the U.S. with IEPA tariffs on them would liquidate. They would finalize this week, and usually once an entry liquidates, it's very hard, if not impossible, to get the refunds on those. So if I were in an importer's shoes right now, which I have been in many past years. I think what I would be doing is contacting my broker and asking my broker if I should be filing protests on at least those entries that were entered in April, if not May of 2025. The reason for that is if you file a protest, it stops liquidation and it can preserve your right to a refund. What I would not do is file protests on all of your entries. I don't think that that's necessary. Um, they're not liquidated yet. They're probably not going to expedite liquidation on those. I don't think some people may disagree with me, but I don't feel like this, customs is out to get anybody in this, right? So I think that, just if you can stay liquidation, if you can keep liquidation from happening on those, again, that's April and May entries of 2025, that might not be a bad idea. As far as whether you need to file a lawsuit in order to be eligible for refunds, I don't think that that's going to be necessary. I'm just not seeing that play out. We've seen in other past cases, there have been some GSP refunds that have happened. There was a big, I forget whether it was HMF or MPF case, maybe late 80s, where that wasn't necessary. I don't see a precedent for that. I could be wrong, right? I don't have a crystal ball, but I don't get the sense that filing a lawsuit is going to be necessary. I think we just really, honestly, other than filing protests for those early April and May entries of last year, I think it's just a matter of waiting for customs to kind of tell everybody what to do and then go from there and follow whatever process they deem is appropriate. So that's my guidance. Let me see, Ivan, also if further details for section, I'm reading what you have in the chat here, Ivan. 9030302 could be shared later. Vessel to port of loading. Yeah. Prior to entering the United States before 1201 and entered for consumption. Okay. So there's an exemption between February 24th and February 28th. All right, thank you for that. I'll definitely look into that a little further, but it looks like you're right there. There is some sort of exemption for those few days. But do you have to pay reciprocal on those? I'll look into that further. Thanks for that, Ivan. All right, so before we move on from IEEPA tariffs, any questions on those? Any questions on what the Supreme Court decided? Any questions on what to do going forward? Any questions at all on the IEEPA tariffs? One thing I want to mention is that if you are on ACE, so that's the US Customs portal, if you're not, it's free, go sign up, just search for CBP ACE, ACE, sign up for that. That is where you can run reports on everything that you've imported into the US where you were the importer of record, okay? You can calculate, there is a report you can run, and I'm happy to help you with this. There's a report you can run that'll show you all of your imports. And then if you know the HTS codes that were associated with the IEEPA tariffs, you can then calculate what your expected refund would be. So again, if you need help with that, reach out. That would be super, detail oriented for this webinar, but there is a way to calculate what your potential, refund opportunity is for when the time comes. But that may help with some financial planning, if you need that. Again, happy to help. All right, moving on from IEEPA tariffs. We have some US trade deals. There are quite a few of them. So I picked a handful of them to talk about here. So there is a trade deal with Indonesia. And this was put into place on July 22nd of last year. It was finalized on February 19th. So just last week, we saw some more information come out on that. So with that, Indonesia was paying a 19% reciprocal tariff rate. So that may change a little bit with this IEEPA decision, but it's possible that some of these deals may still stay in place. So this was again a sort of reciprocal deal with Indonesia. What this isn't, and what none of these deals are free trade agreements. They are not free trade agreements. They're basically the president has negotiated a deal with Indonesia where Indonesia and all of the other countries we're going to talk about are going to provide certain things for the US. In some cases, that means they're going to lower their duty rates on US goods being imported into their country. That's usually the case for most of the deals. In most cases, also, the country has agreed to put some manufacturing, some sort of investment into the US. So whether that means they're going to build a new, facility, a plant, a manufacturing plant, some sort of investment they've promised for the US. So it's a tit for tat agreement where the US is going to do some things for them, namely usually just lower the tariff rate. And it also may get rid of some of those Section 232. So there is a Section 232 investigation on pharmaceuticals and a high duty rate on those at times. And so we may say, okay, well, any pharmaceuticals you want to bring into the US, we'll make duty free. So there's a lot of back and forth on these agreements. So Indonesia is at 19%. There's a trade deal with the EU. And so this came into effect in July of last year. So the EU paid a 15% tariff, including on auto parts, pharmaceuticals, and semiconductors, but they still pay 50% on steel, aluminum, and copper. So this is mostly around Section 232 tariffs, where we said, okay, you can pay less on certain things, but you're still going to pay 50% on other things. And again, in return, the EU, had some similar agreements with US goods going into the EU. Switzerland and Liechtenstein, on November 14th of 2025, the president announced a trade deal with these countries, and it's a 15% reciprocal tariff. So that's much lower than the average. And again, they're going to do some stuff for the US. The US is going to do some stuff for them. If you want to, look up the details, I'm happy to provide you with some links where you can if you're interested in any of these specific countries, I'm happy to provide you with more information. They don't have explicit expiration dates in most cases, Chase. Good question. There are certain aspects that may be for a limited time. For example, we may have said the EU can bring in pharmaceuticals at a lower duty rate for XYZ time, right? So there may be certain aspects of the trade deal that were limited to a time frame, but that doesn't mean that time frame can't be extended. But as far as the deal as a whole, I don't believe they have any expiration dates, not that I've seen. Now, President Trump is only in office for 4 years, right? So we have about 3 years left. What happens when the next president, whoever that is, comes into office? They can certainly renegotiate the trade deals, end them, do whatever they want, right? So, and who knows what President Trump will do, so they don't have expiration dates, but certainly could be renegotiated at any time. India, same sort of thing. February 9th of 2026, we saw a trade deal with India. They're going to pay an 18% reciprocal tariff rate. They're also no longer subject to the additional 25%. So what India did have in place was 2 added tariff rates to their products. So we had a 25% reciprocal tariff rate, and then we had another 25% sort of punitive rate because President Trump was upset that India was purchasing Russian oil. And so India promised in February, earlier this month, to stop buying Russian oil. And so President Trump took away that additional 25% tariff. And then he changed their reciprocal tariff rate from 25% to 18%. So it was at 50% extra coming from India. Now it's down to 18%. So again, things on both sides, different countries doing different things. Oh, that was exciting. I don't know why this is so fancy. All right, so what's next? There are other trade deals too, right? I just touched on some of the bigger ones and, some of the countries. What do we think is next? Well, we're definitely going to have additional Section 232 investigations. There's a long list of ones already in the queue. So these are ones that are already ongoing. So you'll remember Section 232 is your ones on steel, aluminum, copper, automobile parts, that sort of thing. Those are already in place. As a result of the Supreme Court ruling, I think we're going to see this list expand even more. As President Trump tries to get more long-term tariffs on certain industries, certain sectors, right? So you can see here we have robotics, industrial machinery, personal protective equipment, wind turbines, some plastics, commercial aircraft, all kinds of things, pharmaceuticals, semiconductors. So he's targeting certain industries. But the difference is, you'll remember we talked about those 122 tariffs, the ones that went into effect 2 days ago, the 10%. Again, those are only good for 150 days. Section 232 tariffs, as far as I'm aware, have no time limit on them. Some of these have been in place, like steel tariffs have been in place for years and years. So I could see where if President Trump is trying to target certain sectors, even target certain countries, which operate in certain sectors mostly, he's going to use Section 232 as a mechanism. It does take a while to go through a Section 232 investigation. I believe it takes over 200, is either 170 or 270. I believe it's 270 days typically is the average length of an investigation. So whereas President Trump could put the Section 122 tariffs on in less than a week, this isn't a fast way to do it, but it is a long-lasting way to do it. So keep that in mind that we may see more of these. Another big thing happening in the world of trade in the US are these USMCA renegotiations. So you may remember during President Trump's first term in office, we had NAFTA, which was then renegotiated into USMCA. If you're in Canada, it's called CUSMA. If you're in Mexico, it's called TMEC. But it's all the same agreement. So this is the agreement between Canada, Mexico, and the US that goods will enter duty-free. If they meet certain rules of origin, they'll enter in duty-free amongst those three countries. Now, this negotiation is going to be huge. There are some key issues likely to shape negotiations. Again, the negotiation is taking place starting July 1st. So strategic alignment between the countries, supply chain control, limiting Chinese leverage is going to be a big deal, especially when we're seeing nearshoring happen in Mexico. Meaning Chinese companies setting up operations in Mexico. So we want to limit Chinese leverage, strengthening enforcement, and preserving political durability. Automobiles have always been a big portion of NAFTA and now USMCA. So I do think you're going to see some more rules come around automobiles and automobile manufacturing. And that's going to be a contentious part of the negotiations. What a lot of people don't realize is that USMCA and many other free trade agreements don't just address trade. They also address fair wages, rights for women within the three countries and other marginalized groups, human rights type things as well. So automobile manufacturing in Mexico, what is happening a lot, and the wages that are being paid to those workers aren't necessarily always fair. So that's another thing that's going to be included in that. So a lot of labor issues as well. The US is going to push for stronger transparency requirements for sure. But Mexico is going to push back if enforcement is seen as, industrial protectionism disguised as labor rights. So it's going to be interesting to see how it all plays out. And like I said, Chinese manufacturing in Mexico has surged, especially in automotive, electronics, appliances, and other supply chains. So, keep in mind that none of these three countries want to be told by the other countries sort of what to do or what they can allow in their own countries. But they're going to there's in any of these negotiations, there's going to be some give and take, right? So it's going to be contentious at times. There's also some energy policy tensions. Mexico's energy policies have triggered some dispute consultations. The US and Canada are likely going to push for stronger investor protections, clearer non-discrimination rules, and some enforcement mechanisms. So there's also some dispute mechanisms within USMCA that they still have some friction points, whereas they're not really being followed. So expanding that transparency when there are disputes related to USMCA is going to be a big part of it as well. So We'll see, again, like this renegotiation is going to be partly about tariff elimination. It's also going to be about strategic alignment, supply chain control, all of these things that I have on the slide. So it'll be interesting to see, how that plays out. Also keep in mind that under President Trump, and I suppose I should have had a slide about this, eliminated the de minimis rules. So we did see, and it used to be $800 is what you could bring in duty free into the US, and it's not that anymore. And the USMCA does state, what the de minimis rules are for each of the countries. And so the US is no longer holding up to sort of those rules. So again, that's part of that dispute mechanism. And, that part of the agreement, I'm sure, will be renegotiated as it should be. So we are going to see these renegotiations take place this summer. I know the person who's in charge of the renegotiations for Canada. She's amazing. I'm really looking forward to kind of seeing how this all plays out. At the end of the day, what's really changed under President Trump's administration is that compliance is now a lot more strategic than it used to be. It's not administrative. So companies can now no longer treat customs as just file the entry and move on. Now it's, can we restructure to avoid derivative 232s? So in other words, this pen that I showed you earlier, should we make it out of all plastic so that we don't have to pay any extra tariffs on the steel components? It's that sort of thing, right? It's how can we restructure what we're doing, restructure our product, restructure, everything to avoid some of these tariffs. Not avoid them in an illegal, fraudulent sort of way, but avoid them in a strategic, smart, let me figure this out sort of way. Can you move final transformation? So substantial transformation is defined as a change in name, character, or use. Wherever substantial transformation in your product takes place is your country of origin, right? So again, if I have, just a block of plastic, and then in Mexico, I put that block of plastic through some sort of, extrusion machine or some sort of machine that forms it into a shape of a pen and inserts the ink cartridge inside of it. Then that block of plastic has turned into a pen in Mexico. That is where substantial transformation took place. That's my country of origin of my product. I've helped so many clients over the past couple of years move their goods out of China because China had such high tariff rates that they were trying to figure out, how can I make my country of origin for my product anything other than China so that I can have a lower duty rate, right? And again, that's a very solid question to ask, right? It's a very strategic question to ask. Can I do just enough of the manufacturing in China where it keeps my costs down, but finish the good in Taiwan, right? Somewhere else, so that my country of origin, my substantial transformation, my final transformation takes place in Taiwan. Now I get to pay the duties that are in effect on Taiwan as opposed to the duties that are in effect on China, and save sometimes millions of dollars, right? So again, trade has turned into more of a strategic role as opposed to just, let me make sure, these boxes are checked and everything on my entry is correct. They're also asking questions like, can we qualify our goods under USMCA or a different free trade agreement? Free trade agreements are saving so much more money now because the duty rates are so much higher that, we're seeing more people who weren't maybe using them before because it was only saving them, a little bit, or maybe even saving them nothing because the MFN rate was duty free. But now that they can get exempt from these other tariffs, some of them, they do want to try to qualify their goods for a free trade agreement. That's something you should be looking at as well for your goods. Can you use 9802 strategically? So 9802 and Chapter 98 in general allows for various duty exclusions. So for example, if you export something for repair and then you bring it right back to the US, you can bring that good in duty free. So is there a way to kind of use, Chapter 9802 to avoid some of those tariffs? Can you defend valuation if content-based tariffs expand? So again, this goes back to that conversation we had earlier about Section 232 and how it's so difficult to calculate the value of the steel in your product, and how, CBP really needs to release some guidance on that. If this continues, and now instead of just figuring out the content on your steel, your aluminum, your copper, now you have to figure out the value of your plastic or the value of your, I'm just making things up, whatever other materials. How are you going to defend how you valued those? Right. So you need to look into that as well. So again, the main point of this is that compliance has changed as a profession because of President Trump. We're seeing that, it's strategic, it's more strategic, less administrative. The problem though is you still have the administrative work. Now you have the strategic work on top of it. So I don't know about all of y'all, but I'm exhausted. It's been being in global trade has not been for, it's been a lot over the last couple of years for sure. It's long hours, late nights. It's a lot. And even just trying to keep up with everything is hard. So the overall takeaway, we're entering a high tariff, high strategy, high litigation, compliance heavy era. So make sure that a couple of things, you're paying attention to everything going on. Again, I recommend you keep in touch with the whitehouse.gov website. If you follow me on LinkedIn, I post a lot of updates there. So please feel free to do that. Obviously, that's certainly free. White House website, certainly free. You can subscribe there as well for free. The CSMS messages that come from CBP, again, free resource, comes right to your inbox. That is a great way to keep up with everything. There are several publications. Oh, thank you, Fiona. There are several publications out there from various, law firms and consulting groups. I send out one once a month. If you want to get on that, happy to put you on it. That just give like updates on news and what's going on and so on. At the end of the day, give yourself some grace. Right. I want to end with that because this is difficult. It's a lot going on. It's a lot to keep up with. It's a lot to try to understand. Don't beat yourself up if you miss something, or, if you feel overwhelmed. We all feel that way. Reach out to a friend, take a break, try to take a vacation when you can. That's really important. All right. So that's the end of one more thing I want to mention that I just realized I forgot to include in the slideshow. There also is a bill going through going through Congress to try to eliminate the first sale rule. So I wanted to make sure to update you on that. It hasn't gone very far yet. We don't know, if it's going to kind of make it through. But the first sale rule, I'll give you that could be a whole separate webinar, but I'll give you a brief mention of it. It basically says that if you have a middleman outside of the US where, for example, I buy from a distributor located in, pick a country, Singapore. I buy something from a distributor in Singapore. The person in Singapore is buying it from a factory in China. I can import at the price that the Singapore company purchased from China, as opposed to the price that I paid the Singapore company. So I can pay at that first sale value. I can pay duty based on that, as opposed to on that sort of last sale that I paid the Singapore company. That's what first sale says. Some people in Congress feel as though that is a loophole that's being exploited, that is allowing U.S. importers to pay a lower duty rate. I wouldn't refer to it as a loophole, but yeah, it does allow U.S. companies to pay a lower duty rate. That was kind of the whole point. But they feel as though that's not appropriate. So there is a bill going through to try to eliminate it. I don't think it's going to pass, but again, it's so at the beginning that it's hard to tell how much support it has just yet. So didn't include that in the slides. Wanted to make sure to mention it, since that is going on. But again, it may or may not come to fruition. So I'll stop talking there. Anyone have any questions, comments, concerns, anything I can answer for you?
Sure. I have another question.
Yeah.
So when it comes to the U.S. trade deals, do we know if if that would supersede the Section 122? Like for instance, so instead of paying 10% in Europe, would we do the 15%? Because I mean, technically that would make sense, right?
It would.
Okay.
Um, I don't know. Again, this is all
Okay.
new for me too, right? It happened over the last 2 days. Let me find out when I email you about the 122 exemptions. I'm going to email you about that too.
Okay. All right. Thank you again.
No problem. Making a little note here just to remind myself. Okay.
Right.
Great questions though. We're going to figure it out together. Any other questions from anyone? Okay. If you come up with any, feel free to email me. I think I have my email on here. Yes, it's Bonnie@magnoliaglobaltrade.com. I'm happy to answer any questions that you have. I know some people don't want to ask questions in front of a group, so there's my email address. Feel free to email me and ask your questions there. Otherwise, have a great rest of your day. Fiona, I don't know if you had anything you wanted to
Thank you.
close with.
No, I was just going to say sometimes it just takes a few minutes or a while to digest the information and then come back with questions and refer
Totally.
back to our, when we go back to our desk to see what you've just told us and how that can potentially affect us. So thank you for the opportunity of asking you questions later
Of
on.
course.
Yeah, brilliant. And thanks a million, everybody, for being with us today.
Yeah, and if anyone is going to be at the ICPA conference that begins this weekend, please come say hello. I would love to meet you and just speak with you and make sure you're doing okay through all of this.
I definitely will, Bonnie. Thanks.
Great, great.
Super. Thanks, Erin. Thanks, Martin. Great. Okay, listen, thanks a million. Thank you, Bonnie, for sharing your expertise. There's so much, as you said at the beginning, there's so much that's just happening as we speak. So to be able to get a comprehensive overview of all of that in 1 hour is just excellent. So thank you very much. And thanks everybody for coming along.
Thanks very much.
Thanks,
Thank
Martin.
you. Thank you for
See you
attending.
soon. Take care.